The great hall of Oakhaven didn't breathe, it only trembled. King Theodric sat upon the obsidian throne, his gaze a whetstone sharpening the silence into a blade. At his feet, the young Prince Cailan, the cub, whose temper was already legendary, lunged with a snarl. The sound of tearing silk echoed like a thunderclap. His small, sharp teeth sank deep into the silver-threaded sleeve of Evangeline, the Omega ward whose presence was a fragile mercy. "Cailan, release her," a duke hissed, his face ashen. The court froze, expecting the king to strike her for provoking the bloodline. But as the child growled, Evangeline didn't flinch. She leaned in, her fingers closing around the fabric, and tugged back. Her lips curved into a slow, devastating smile. The air in the citadel of Oakhaven always tasted of cold iron and old smoke. It was a place where softness went to die, and King Theodric was its architect. He was a man carved from the very mountains he ruled, broad-shouldered, scarred, and possessed of eyes that saw through flesh to the marrow of a person's secrets. To the world, he was the Alpha King, a monarch who had united the fractured territories through a campaign so ruthless the rivers had run red for a decade. Tonight was the Feast of the Equinox, a celebration that felt more like a calculated display of power than a party. The long tables groaned under the weight of roasted boar and heavy tons of ale, yet the lords and ladies spoke in hushed tones. No one laughed too loudly, no one moved too quickly. To draw the king's attention was to invite an audit of one's soul. Evangeline sat at the far end of the high table, a position of both honor and profound vulnerability. She was the last of the Valerians, a fallen house of Omegas, known for their scholars and poets, traits the new regime found useless. She was a ward, a polite term for a political prisoner kept to ensure the southern borders remain quiet. Her dress was a pale, shimmering silver, a stark contrast to the dark leathers and heavy furs worn by the Oakhaven court. "You look as though you are preparing for a funeral, Evangeline," Theodric's voice rumbled. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the ambient noise of clashing cutlery. Evangeline didn't look up immediately. She smoothed a napkin over her lap with steady hands. "In a den of wolves, Your Majesty. One does well to remember that every feast begins with a kill." Theodric's hand, wrapped around a golden goblet, paused. His knuckles were white. "A sharp tongue for a girl who lives by my grace alone." "Grace is a beautiful word for a leash," she replied softly, finally meeting his gaze. Her eyes were a deep, defiant violet. Between them sat Prince Cailan. Only 6 winters old, the boy was a mirror image of his father's volatility, but lacked the king's discipline. He was the cub, the miracle child born to a queen who had died bringing him into the world. Since then, Cailan had been raised by generals and masters at arms. He knew how to command, how to strike, and how to hate, but he had never been taught how to love. Cailan was bored. He hated the long speeches. He hated the smell of the heavy perfumes. Most of all, he hated the way his father looked at the woman in silver. In the boy's mind, she was a soft thing, a weak thing, an Omega who didn't belong in the fortress of iron. He reached out, his small hand snatching a heavy steak knife from the table, but a guard quickly moved it away. Frustrated, the boy's inner wolf, the raw, untamed instinct of his lineage, flared. He turned toward Evangeline, his eyes glowing with a faint, predatory amber. With a sudden, violent movement, the prince lunged. He didn't use his hands. He snapped his jaw shut on the flowing fabric of her bell-shaped sleeve. The sound of silk rending was sickeningly loud in the sudden hush of the hall. The music died. A tray of goblets crashed to the floor in the distance. The court stood as one, a collective gasp rippling through the room. The guards reached for their swords, not to protect the woman, but out of a conditioned reflex to the prince's aggression. Everyone knew the law. To touch the royal bloodline was death. To cause the prince to lose his temper was a crime of the highest order. Theodric leaned forward, his shadow engulfing both the boy and the woman. His face was unreadable, a mask of stone. "Evangeline," he warned, his voice a low vibration that felt like a threat. The prince growled through the fabric, his teeth bared, pulling back with all his might to tear the sleeve from her shoulder, to humiliate her, to make her cry. But Evangeline didn't cry. She didn't pull away. Instead, she reached down with her free hand and gripped the silk just inches from the boy's mouth. She planted her feet. The room held its breath. She wasn't just holding on, she was resisting. She was tugging back against the future king of Oakhaven. And then she smiled. It wasn't a smile of submission. It was the smile of a woman who had already lost everything, and therefore feared nothing. The silence that followed was so thick it felt like physical pressure. Theodric's eyes moved from the torn silk to Evangeline's face. He had seen men plead for their lives with more dignity than she was currently showing in her defiance. "Release him, Evangeline," Theodric commanded. The threat was no longer implied. It was overt. "The boy is a prince. You are a guest of the state." "I am releasing nothing, sire," she said, her voice clear and melodic, carrying to the very back of the hall. "The prince has chosen his prize. It would be rude of me to let him take it without a struggle. Isn't that what you teach your soldiers, that nothing worth having is given freely?" Kalen's eyes widened. He shook his head, trying to rip the fabric, but Evangeline's grip was surprisingly strong. She was an Omega, yes, but the Valyrians were descendants of the mountain herders who had survived the Great Freeze. Her bones were made of different stuff than the pampered court realized. Theodric stood up, but he was a mountain of a man, and as he stepped around the table, the lords and ladies scrambled backward. He stopped directly behind his son, placing a heavy hand on the boy's shoulder. "Kalen," the king said, "let go." The boy let out a muffled sound of protest, his teeth still locked. "I said, let go." Slowly, the prince opened his jaw. He slumped back against his father's legs, a damp, jagged hole left in Evangeline's silver sleeve. The skin of her arm was visible, pale, unmarred, and shivering slightly from the rush of adrenaline. Evangeline didn't tuck her arm away. She didn't try to hide the damage. She stood up, smoothing the ruined silk as if it were a badge of honor. "You've ruined a very expensive gift, Prince Kalen," she said, looking the boy in the eye. "It was the last thing my mother wove before the fires took her loom. Tell me, what will you give me in return?" A collective shudder went through the room. To demand restitution from the prince, it was madness. Theodric looked at the torn sleeve, then at the girl. He remembered the fires. He had been the one who ordered the Valyrian estates cleared. He hadn't known about the looms. He hadn't cared, until now. "She speaks of the fires as if they were a tragedy." A voice whispered from the crowd. Lady Isolde, a high-born alpha who had long sought Theodric's hand. They were a cleansing. Evangeline's smile didn't falter, but it grew colder. She turned her gaze to Isolde. "A cleansing, my lady. Then perhaps you should stand closer to the hearth. You seem to have a great deal of dross left to burn." Isolde gasped, her hand flying to her throat. Theodric's mouth twitched, the ghost of a grim amusement. He turned back to his son. "The woman asked you a question, Kalen. You took her property. What is the law of the pack?" Kalen looked up at his father, confused. "The strong take what they want." "And the weak," Theodric prompted. "The weak serve," the boy recited. Theodric looked at Evangeline. "You hear him. By the law of this land, you have been mastered. Your sleeve is a trophy." "Then the law of this land is built on a lie," Evangeline said. She stepped closer to the king, ignoring the guards who moved to intercept her. She stopped when her chest was inches from his black leather doublet. "The boy didn't take the sleeve because he was strong. He took it because he was lonely. He wanted to see if I would break. He wanted to see if anyone in this cold, dead castle still had a pulse." She reached out, a move so fast Theodric didn't have time to block it, and touched the golden sigil on his chest. "You've taught him how to bite, Theodric, but who will teach him how to lead?" The king's hand snapped out, catching her wrist in a grip that would have crushed a lesser woman's bones. He leaned down, his breath smelling of wine and winter. "I am the king," he hissed. "I lead by the strength of my arm and the sharp edge of my word. I do not need lessons from a relic of a dead world." Then kill me, she whispered. Finish what you started in the Valerian Valley, and the relic. Or are you afraid that without me, there will be no one left to tell you the truth? Theodric stared into her violet eyes. He felt a strange, unwelcome heat rising in his chest. It wasn't just anger. It was in recognition. For the first time in years, he wasn't looking at a subject. He was looking at an equal. He released her wrist with a shove. Get out. Take the boy to his chambers. Since you are so concerned with his education, you shall be his governess, starting tonight. The room erupted in murmurs. An Omega, a prisoner, raising the Alpha heir. It was unheard of. It was a scandal. Evangeline bowed, a slow, graceful movement that mocked the very idea of his authority. She reached down and took Kaelin's hand. The boy flinched, then, to everyone's shock, he allowed her to lead him away. As they walked out of the hall, the torn silver sleeve fluttered behind her like a ghost. Theodric is established as a man who equates power with silence and physical dominance. His cruelty isn't mindless. It's a tool of statecraft. Evangeline, conversely, uses her perceived weakness, her status as an Omega, as a shield. She understands that in a court of monsters, the most dangerous person is the one who isn't afraid to die. The contrast between the iron of the setting and the silver silk of Evangeline is meant to highlight the clash between the old world of culture and the new world of conquest. The smile is the ultimate weapon here. It unnerves the king because he cannot understand its source. The prince's chambers were not a place for a child. They were a barracks for a miniature soldier. There were no wooden knights, no painted blocks, no tapestries depicting heroes. Instead, the walls were adorned with blunt training swords, maps of the northern frontiers, and the stuffed head of a mountain cat. The boy's first kill, assisted by a dozen hunters. Evangeline closed the heavy oak door, the click of the latch sounding like a guillotine. Kaelin stood in the center of the room, his small chest heaving. He still tasted the silver thread of her sleeve on his tongue. He looked at her, expecting a lecture, a slap, or the cold, silent dismissal he usually received from the palace staff. Instead, Evangeline walked to the wash basin, dipped a cloth in cool water, and began to wipe the blood-flecked silk of her sleeve. She didn't look at him. "Why didn't you scream?" Kaelin demanded. His voice was high and thin, trembling with a mix of fury and confusion. "Everyone screams when I bite. The maids cry. The masters yell. Why did you smile?" Evangeline squeezed the water from the cloth. "Because, little prince, screaming is what people do when they are surprised. I wasn't surprised. I knew exactly what you were going to do the moment you looked at me." Kaelin squinted at her. "You're a lie. My father says Omegas are transparent. He says you are all heart and no bone. Your father has spent a long time breaking bones to see what's inside," she said, finally turning to face him. Her violet eyes were soft, but they held a weight that made the boy take a step back. "But some things, like the scent of a storm or the memory of a song, cannot be broken by a hammer. He hasn't learned that yet." She walked toward his bed, a hard, narrow thing with furs that smelled of damp wolf. She began to strip the heavy, oppressive blankets. "What are you doing?" "Those are the king's furs." "They are itchy and they smell of old blood," Evangeline replied. "If you are to be my student, you must first learn the value of a good night's sleep. A rested mind is sharper than any blade on that wall." Kaelin watched her, fascinated and repulsed. He was used to being feared. Fear was the only currency he understood. But this woman, she treated him like a person, not a weapon or a burden. "I'm going to tell my father you're a traitor," he whispered, though the threat lacked its usual bite. "You should," she agreed, pulling a small, hidden pouch from her waistband. She opened it, and the scent of lavender and dried chamomile filled the room, cutting through the iron and smoke. "But before you do, tell me, why did you choose the sleeve? You could have bitten my hand. You could have kicked my shins." Kaelin looked at the floor. The glow in his eyes had faded to a dull gold. "The silver. It was the only thing in the room that didn't look like it wanted to kill me. I wanted to see if it would turn black if I touched it." Evangeline's heart ached, a sharp, sudden pang she hadn't felt in years. She knelt before him, ignoring the ruin of her dress. Softness isn't a disease, Kaelin. It's a choice, to be strong enough to be kind. That is the true mark of a king. She reached out, and for a moment, the boy didn't flinch. He let her hand rest on his hair. It was the first time a woman had touched him with anything other than clinical duty since his mother died. In the shadows of the doorway, unnoticed by either, King Theodric watched. His jaw was set, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. He had come to deliver a warning, but the sight of the Omega's hand on his son's head stayed his breath. It was a sight he hadn't known, he feared until this very moment. Theodric retreated into the dark corridor, his boots silent on the stone. He didn't return to the feast. Instead, he climbed the winding stairs to the North Tower, where the wind howled through the battlements. He was a man who lived by logic. Rule 1. Eliminate threats. Rule 2. Reward loyalty. Rule 3. Never allow the heart to dictate the hand. Evangeline was a threat. Not because she had a dagger, but because she had a philosophy. She was a remnant of the Valerian culture he had systematically dismantled. A culture that prioritized art over steel and empathy over empire. He had killed her family, burned her home, and kept her as a trophy to remind the world of his victory. But as he looked out over the darkened kingdom, he felt a flicker of doubt. The boy, Kaelin, was becoming a monster. Theodric knew it. He saw the way the servants cringed, the way the lords whispered about a mad heir. He had thought he could mold the boy into a version of himself, but he was starting to realize he had only succeeded in creating a void. "You are thinking of her," a voice purred. Theodric didn't turn. He knew the scent of Lady Isolda's rosewater perfume anywhere. "I am thinking of the boy's education, Isolda, nothing more." The lady stepped into the moonlight, her silk robes flowing around her. She was beautiful, sharp, and ambitious. She wanted the crown, and she knew the quickest way to it was through the king's bed and the prince's favor. "The Omega is a cancer," Isolda said, her voice dropping to a hiss. "She fills the boy's head with valerian rot. Lavender and songs, that is how you lose a kingdom, Theodric. Your ancestors would weep." "My ancestors are dead, and their bones are the foundation of this tower," Theodric replied coldly. "I will decide what is rot and what is medicine." "She smiled at you," Isolda countered, stepping closer. "In the hall, when Kaelin bit her. She smiled as if she had won. Do you not see it? She's playing a game with us all. She wants to turn the boy against you. She wants to see the house of Oakhaven fall from within." Theodric turned to her then, his eyes burning. "She smiled because she has nothing left to lose. Can you say the same, Isolda, or is your loyalty tied to the weight of the gold in my vaults?" Isolda recoiled as if he had struck her. She bowed stiffly and hurried away, her mind already spinning a web of gossip and sabotage. Theodric remained on the tower, the wind biting at his skin. He remembered the night the Valerian capital fell. He remembered seeing a young girl standing in the middle of a burning library, holding a single book as if it were a shield. He had spared her then on a whim, thinking her spirit would be broken by the time she reached Oakhaven. He had been wrong. Her spirit hadn't broken. It had merely been tempered. She tugged back, he whispered to the night. He looked at his own hand, the one that had gripped her wrist. He could still feel the pulse of her heart, steady, rhythmic, and utterly unafraid. The following morning, the tension in the citadel reached a breaking point. It was the trial of the squires, a day when the noble children of the court demonstrated their martial prowess before the king. Kaelin was expected to lead the opening drill. He stood in the courtyard, clad in heavy leather and carrying a wooden training sword. His face was a mask of misery. Behind him stood the other boys, larger and more aggressive, encouraged by their fathers to outshine the cub. Evangeline watched from the gallery, sitting among the ladies of the court who treated her like an invisible stain. She noticed Kaelin's grip on the sword. It was too tight. He wasn't looking at his opponent. He was looking at his father, Theodric sat on the dais, his expression impartial. Beside him, Isolde leaned in, whispering something that made him frown. The signal was given. Kalen lunged at a boy twice his size. The older boy, coached by his father to test the prince's mettle, didn't hold back. He parried Kalen's strike and delivered a punishing blow to the prince's ribs. Kalen fell to the dirt. A gasp went up from the crowd. The boy scrambled up, his face red, his eyes beginning to glow, that dangerous amber. He lunged again, but his form was sloppy, driven by rage rather than skill. Again he was knocked down. "Is this the future of Oakhaven?" A lord chuckled nearby. "A cub who can't even stand." Kalen snapped. He dropped his wooden sword and lunged at the other boy with his bare hands, his teeth bared. He was going for the throat. He was going to bite. "Kalen, stop!" Theodric roared, standing up. But the boy was beyond words. The wolf had taken over. Suddenly, a flash of silver moved through the crowd. Evangeline didn't run. She glided, her movements a blur of practiced grace. She reached the center of the courtyard just as Kalen was about to sink his teeth into the other boy's shoulder. She didn't grab him. She didn't hit him. She simply stepped between them and held out a small, carved wooden bird, the toy she had spent the entire night carving from a piece of scrap wood. "Kalen," she said softly, "look." The boy froze. His teeth were inches from the other child's skin. He looked at the bird. It was simple, unpainted, but its wings were spread as if in flight. It was the first soft thing he had ever been offered in public. The courtyard fell into a deathly silence. The guards moved forward, but Theodric raised a hand to stop them. Kalen's chest heaved. The amber in his eyes flickered and died. He reached out with a trembling hand and took the bird. It doesn't have a sword," Kalen whispered. "No," Evangeline replied, her voice carrying in the stillness. "It has wings, because it knows that the sky is bigger than the battlefield." From the dais, Theodric watched as his son, the boy he had tried to harden into a weapon, clutched the wooden toy to his chest and wept, not out of pain but out of a sudden, overwhelming release of pressure. Evangeline looked up at the king. She didn't bow. She didn't apologize for interrupting the trial. She simply smiled. The same devastating, knowing smile from the night before. She had won this round, and Theodric knew it. Isolde turned to the king, her face pale with fury. She has humiliated the prince. She has made him weak in front of the entire court. Theodric looked at his son, who was being led away by Evangeline, the boy's hand tucked firmly into hers. For the first time in years, Kalen's shoulders weren't hunched with the weight of expectation. "No, Isolde," Theodric said, his voice a low growl. "She hasn't made him weak. She has made him human, and that is far more dangerous." Kalen's transformation starts here. He is a child reacting to a vacuum of affection by introducing the wooden bird. Evangeline provides a contrast to the iron world. Theodric's internal monologue reveals that he is not just a tyrant. He is a man trapped by his own philosophy of strength. Serves as the trial. It's the public version of the private bite in the hook. It shows that Evangeline's influence is starting to manifest in ways the court cannot ignore. The tension is no longer just between two people. It's a cultural war. The king's solar was a room of stone and strategy. Maps of the conquered south were pinned to the walls with iron spikes, and the air was heavy with the scent of wax and old parchment. Theodric sat behind a desk of dark oak, his shadow cast long by the flickering fire. He had summoned Evangeline under the cover of night, away from the prying eyes of the court and the sharp ears of Lady Isolde. Evangeline entered with the same quiet dignity that had become her armor. She wore a different dress now, a simple gown of deep forest green, but the silver-threaded sleeve of her previous gown sat on the desk between them, a jagged reminder of the cub's bite. "You are teaching him to weep in public," Theodric began, his voice like the grinding of tectonic plates. "In this kingdom, tears are considered blood that has lost its courage. You are making him a target." I am teaching him that he is more than a weapon, Theodric, she replied, refusing the seat he hadn't offered. She walked to the window, looking out at the snowy peaks. A sword that cannot be sheathed eventually breaks. Is that what you want for your son? On to be a collection of shards held together by fear. Theodric stood, his presence filling the room. He moved with the grace of a predator, stopping just behind her. Fear is what keeps the borders secure. Fear is why the Valyrians no longer have a king. Evangeline turned to face him. The proximity was electric, a clash of heat and cold. The Valyrians didn't fall because of a lack of fear. We fell because we believed the world was better than men like you. We were wrong about the world, but I am not wrong about Kaelin. Theodric reached out, his fingers brushing the fabric of her sleeve. Not the green one she wore, but the ruined silver one on the desk. Why do you smile when he hurts you? I have seen men beg for mercy under less pressure. I have seen warriors break. But you smile as if you were the one holding the leash. Because I know something you've forgotten, she whispered, her gaze locked on his. Power isn't the ability to inflict pain. Power is the ability to endure it without becoming the person who gave it to you. Theodric's hand moved from the silk to her chin, tilting her head back. His thumb traced the line of her jaw. For a moment, the king's mask slipped, and she saw the man beneath, the boy who had been raised in a fortress of iron, the youth who had seen his own parents betrayed by softness. You are a dangerous ghost, Evangeline, he murmured. And you are a lonely king, she countered. He didn't pull away. He didn't strike her. Instead, he leaned in until their foreheads touched, a gesture of intimacy and challenge that was more intimate than a kiss. The silence in the solar wasn't the heavy silence of the Great Hall. It was the breathless silence of a storm about to break. The following week, a delegation from the Frost Isles arrived, led by the ruthless Duke Varric. The Isles were the only territory Theodric hadn't fully subdued, and the atmosphere was thick with the threat of renewed war. A grand banquet was held, intended to show the unity and strength of Oakhaven. Lady Isolde saw her opportunity. She had spent the last few days cultivating the prince's trust, bringing him sweets and stories of his father's glory. But Kaelin remained distant, his pockets always containing the wooden bird Evangeline had carved for him. During the feast, while the Duke and Theodric debated border taxes, Isolde slipped a clear, tasteless liquid into a goblet of honey wine. She didn't intend to kill the prince. That would be madness. She intended to make him ill, a vile reaction to the Valyrian herbs Evangeline used in his nursery. She would frame the Omega for poisoning the heir. A toast to the future king, Duke Varric announced, raising his glass. Kaelin reached for his goblet, but as he did, he looked at Evangeline. She was watching him from her seat, her eyes narrowed. She had noticed the way Isolde's hand had lingered over the boy's drink. She had seen the flicker of triumph in the lady's eyes. As Kaelin lifted the cup to his lips, Evangeline stood up. Wait, she said, her voice cutting through the laughter. The room fell silent. Theodric looked at her, his brow furrowing. Evangeline, sit down. We are in the middle of a formal toast. The wine is sour, Your Majesty, she said, her voice steady. The prince has a delicate palate. Allow me to taste it first to ensure it is worthy of the House of Oakhaven. Isolde's face went white. It is a gift from the Frost Isles. To question it is an insult to our guests. Duke Varric laughed, a cold, barking sound. Let the girl drink. If she dies, we know the wine is good enough for an Omega. Theodric's eyes flashed with anger, but he gestured for the cup. Evangeline took it. She looked at Theodric, then at Kaelin, and finally at Isolde. She knew what was in the cup. She knew the risks, but she also knew that if she didn't do this, Kaelin would be the one to suffer. She took a long, deliberate sip. The room waited. 10 seconds. 20. Evangeline handed the cup back to a servant, her expression unchanged. It is adequate, she said, her voice slightly strained. Isolde looked confused. The poison should have worked instantly, causing a violent fit of coughing and nausea. But Evangeline remained standing. She even smiled, a small, pained version of her usual defiance. But as the feast continued, the color drained from Evangeline's face. She swayed on her feet, her hand reaching for the table to steady herself. "Evangeline?" Kalen asked, his voice full of sudden alarm. She didn't answer. She collapsed, her body hitting the stone floor with a dull thud. The silver embroidery on her bodice seemed to catch the light one last time before her eyes fluttered shut. "Guards!" Theodric roared, leaping from the dais. He reached her before anyone else, scooping her into his arms. He didn't look at the Duke. He didn't look at his son. He looked only at the woman who had just traded her life for his heir's safety. Evangeline lay in the king's own bed, the primary chamber of the citadel, transformed into a sanctuary of healing. The royal physicians were baffled. The poison wasn't a standard toxin. It was a rare extract from the Frost Isles, designed to mimic a slow-acting fever. Theodric stood by the window, his back to the room. Kalen sat on a stool by the bed, holding Evangeline's hand. The boy hadn't eaten or slept in 2 days. He had his wooden bird in his other hand, pressing it against her palm as if trying to transfer its wings to her. "She saved me, father," Kalen whispered. "She knew." Theodric turned. His face was a mask of cold, concentrated fury. He had spent the last 48 hours dismantling Isolde's web. He had found the vial in her chambers. He had heard the confessions of the servants she had bribed. "I know," Theodric said. At that moment, the doors to the chamber burst open. Lady Isolde was dragged in by 2 guards, her hair disheveled, her dress torn. "Theodric, this is a mistake," she cried. "The Omega poisoned herself to gain your sympathy. She is a Valyrian witch." Theodric walked toward her, his footsteps echoing like drum beats. He didn't stop until he was inches from her face. He didn't yell. He didn't strike her. He simply spoke in a voice that was quieter and more terrifying than any roar. "You touched my son," he said. "You tried to use a child as a pawn in your pursuit of a crown you will never wear." "I did it for Oakhaven," she screamed, "to save you from her." "You did it for yourself," Theodric replied. He looked at the guards. "Take her to the black cells. She will stay there until the Omega wakes. If Evangeline dies, Isolde dies. If Evangeline lives, Isolde stays in the dark until she forgets what the sun looks like." As Isolde was dragged away, screaming, a soft moan came from the bed. Theodric was at the bedside in an instant, pushing past the physicians. Evangeline's eyes opened, dull, clouded with pain, but still that unmistakable violet. She looked at the king, then at the boy. "Kalen," she breathed. "I'm here," the boy sobbed, throwing his arms around her. Evangeline's gaze moved to Theodric. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his hands were shaking. She reached out, her fingers brushing the dark leather of his doublet, just as she had in the solar. You stayed," she whispered. Theodric took her hand, his large palm engulfing hers. He didn't care who was watching. He didn't care about the laws of the Alphas or the expectations of the court. "I have spent my life building walls, Evangeline," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But you just tugged on the sleeve, and the whole fortress started to crumble." Evangeline smiled. It was weak, but it was there. "I told you, the sky's bigger than the battlefield." Theodric finally breaks his iron code. The act of bringing her to his own bed is a massive symbolic shift. It signifies that she is no longer a ward, but a part of his inner circle. Evangeline's sacrifice solidifies her role as the heart of the story, showing that her strength is active, not passive. The poisoning plot by Isolde is a classic trope, but I wanted to use it to highlight the difference between political ambition, Isolde, and moral authority, Evangeline. The unpredictable twist isn't the poisoning itself, but Theodric's immediate and total rejection of Isolde in favor of the Omega. The recurring theme of tugging is referenced again in Chapter 8. It's no longer about a physical sleeve, it's about the emotional threads that connect these characters. The wooden bird becomes a bridge between Kalen's innocence and Evangeline's wisdom. The Alpha King's cub bit the Omega's sleeve. Final part. The snow began to fall in earnest. the day Duke Varric of the Frost Isles demanded an audience. The great hall, once a place of trembling silence, felt different now. The scent of lavender still lingered from the prince's quarters, and the servants walked with a lighter step, though the king's obsidian throne remained as imposing as ever. Evangeline stood at Theodric's right hand. She was pale, the lingering effects of the poison making her look like a creature of moonlight. But she was draped in a cloak of heavy white fur, a gift from the king's own private stores. On her left arm, the silver sleeve had been expertly mended, the jagged tear now replaced by a delicate embroidery of willow branches. Duke Varric entered with a retinue of armored men, their boots clanking like a call to war. He didn't bow. He looked at Evangeline with a sneer that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "You keep a dead house at your right hand, Theodric," Varric barked, his voice echoing off the rafters, "and you imprison a noble alpha like Isolde on the word of a common ward. The Frost Isles do not take well to such insults. My sister was to be your queen. This Omega is a stain on the bloodline." Theodric didn't move. He sat with his chin resting on a closed fist, his gaze boring into the Duke. "Your sister attempted to murder my heir, Varric. In Oakhaven we call that treason. In the Frost Isles perhaps you call it family dinner, but here it is a debt paid in iron." "Isolde acted out of love for your kingdom," Varric countered, stepping forward until the king's guards crossed their halberds. "She saw you being bewitched. Look at you. You've traded your sword for a governess. You're weak, Theodric, and a weak alpha has no right to the mountain passes." A low growl vibrated through the hall. It didn't come from the king. Prince Kaelin stepped forward from behind his father's throne. He wasn't carrying a training sword. He was carrying the wooden bird, its wings polished smooth by his constant touch. He looked at the Duke, his amber eyes clear and steady. "My father isn't weak," Kaelin said, his voice ringing with a new kind of authority. "He's just learned that a king who only knows how to bite is eventually eaten by his own pack." The Duke laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "The cub speaks. Did the Omega teach you those words, boy? Did she teach you to hide behind her skirts?" "She taught me to look at the sky," Kaelin replied. He walked toward the Duke, stopping just out of reach. He reached out and grabbed the edge of Varric's heavy, fur-lined sleeve. The room froze. It was a mirror of the moment weeks ago, the moment that had started it all. Varric looked down at the child, his hand twitching toward the dagger at his belt. "Let go of me, brat," Varric hissed. Kaelin didn't let go. He looked at Evangeline, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. Then, the prince looked back at the Duke and tugged. He didn't tug with the desperate violence of a hungry animal. He tugged with the deliberate weight of a promise. "You want the passes?" Kaelin asked. "Then you'll have to take them from me. But I won't bite you, Duke Varric. I'll simply wait for you to realize that no one follows a man who has no heart to defend." Theodric stood up then, the movement so sudden. It was like a mountain rising. He stepped down from the dais and stood behind his son, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder, the same gesture he had used when Kaelin had bitten Evangeline. But this time, his grip was a shield, not a command. "The boy is right," Theodric said. "The era of the Iron Wolf is over. If the Frost Isles want war, you will find us ready. But if you want a future where our children don't have to sleep with daggers under their pillows, you will bow to the woman who saved the House of Oakhaven." Theodric turned to Evangeline. He reached out his hand, and for the first time in the history of Oakhaven, a king knelt before an Omega. "Evangeline of House Valerian," he said, his voice thick with a truth he had spent a lifetime denying. "You tugged at my sleeve when I was lost in the dark. If you smiled when the world told you to scream. Will you stay and teach me how to be a king of men and not just a king of shadows?" The court gasped. This was the unpredictable twist. The Alpha King, the butcher of the South, surrendering his pride to a woman he had once called a relic. Evangeline looked down at him. She saw the scars on his face, the weariness in his soul, and the flickering hope in his eyes. She looked at Kaelin, who was smiling, his wooden bird held high. She reached out and took Theodric's hand, pulling him back to his feet. She didn't bow, she simply smiled. The same slow, devastating, beautiful smile that had started a revolution. "I will stay," she whispered, "but only if you promise to keep tugging back." Duke Varric, seeing the absolute unity of the king, the heir, and the Omega, realized the Frost Isles could never break Oakhaven from within. He bowed, stiffly and with great reluctance, and backed out of the hall. The silence that followed was not one of fear, it was the silence of a new morning. The story of the Alpha King and his Omega Queen became a legend that lasted 1,000 years. They didn't rule with an iron fist, nor did they rule with a soft heart alone. They ruled with the balance of both. Prince Kaelin grew into a man who never forgot the weight of a silver sleeve or the flight of a wooden bird. And whenever the shadows of the past threatened to return, Evangeline would simply look at her king, catch his gaze, and tug at his sleeve, and he, with a heart finally at peace, would always smile back. If this tale of iron and silk touched your heart, don't forget to like this chronicle, share it with your fellow travelers, and subscribe to our scrolls for more stories from the kingdoms of old. On character development, in this final chapter, the transformation of all three leads is complete. Theodric's kneeling is the ultimate subversion of his alpha nature, proving that true strength is the ability to show vulnerability. Kaelin's growth from a biting cub to a leading heir is mirrored in his use of the sleeve-tugging gesture against the Duke, turning his former shame into a tool of diplomacy. On plot and moral resonance, the unpredictable twist here isn't a betrayal or a death, but a change of heart. In a genre often defined by violence, the decision to have the conflict resolved through moral authority, rather than a sword fight, is meant to provide a meaningful resonance. The crown of willow and iron symbolizes the union of Evangeline's flexibility and Theodric's strength. The story ends where it began, in the Great Hall, with a tug on a sleeve. This circular narrative structure emphasizes that while the actions remained the same, the intent behind them changed everything. The smile is no longer a shield for Evangeline. It is a shared language between her and the king.